All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We're really excited. When the crisis first occurred, Jessica was one of the first people I thought about just because of the work she does. And I thought I would love to get her perspective on this. Jessica is a member of Hamilton College's class of 2014, where she double majored in communication and women's studies and graduated cum laude. She's also a member of Hamilton College's first Miami Posse cohort. She earned her master's in journalism at the University of Southern California's Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism and received the prestigious Annenberg Graduate Fellowship. Jessica currently works at The Root, an online magazine of Black news, opinions, politics, and culture, where she focuses on politics, race, social justice issues. She appeared in the Columbia Journalism Review, BBC News, The Global Post, Univision News, Cheddar, Splinter News, Fusion TV, and more. And I'm very excited to turn it over to Jessica, who will now start sharing her screen.
Hey everyone, I'm Jessica. That was my very long bio. So I want to say thank you to all of the members of the Career Center. I work there on campus, so I always have like a special place in my heart. Whenever they have an ask, I would absolutely love to help whenever I can. So that was a really great introduction about me. Prior to COVID-19 essentially becoming my beat, I focused a lot on politics, social justice, and the intersection of like race as it pertains to all of these different areas of life. So more recently, I've been working on stories about the coronavirus. And I think a couple of the stories that I've touched on and I've produced, one came out last week, and it was about 3 Black New Yorkers and how they are dealing with COVID-19. And as we've seen on the news that has come out recently because of a ProPublica report, Black people and other communities of color are disproportionately impacted and are getting the virus as well as like dying from the virus. So on that happy note, I'm going to share my screen with you all, and I would love to show you something that I produced. Let me know if you can hear it well. I will also have the perfect. All right, and then I already had the ad work because capitalism. So I'm going to make the screen larger.
Oh, I can't hear it.
Oh, okay. Let me take my headphones out. Okay. Let me know if you can hear it now.
The virus is serious. It's killing people.
Yes.
It's killing Black people, for sure.
My name is Nicholas Ryan Gant, and I'm 37 years old, and I live in Harlem, New York.
My name is Janice. I am 27, and I am from Queens, New York.
My name is Celeste Denby. I am 36 years old. I live in Long Island, New York.
I first started exhibiting symptoms for coronavirus probably like after a couple of days of me going to a bar. And I didn't think anything of it. I just thought like, oh, my allergies were acting up, or my asthma was acting up. I was like sweating, and I got really cold, so I was going through sweats and chills. And my body was in a lot of pain. So I just knew something was wrong. That morning I woke up and I took my temperature, and it was 101.9.
I had symptoms of like extreme fatigue, body aches, chills, headaches. I could hear like bubbles in my chest. It was like when I was breathing.
I had a cough. I had a very high fever. I had body aches. I had diarrhea. Very, very tired.
The test was, it was very, very uncomfortable. I had my eyes closed because I didn't really want to see it, but they stuck, I guess, a scope like all the way down. It felt like it touched the back of my brain. Like it went so far down and it's burned, and it made my nose bleed.
So I did see the myth about Black folks not being able to contract the coronavirus on social media, but you know, it's the internet, it's Black Twitter, like, you know, I know it was like all jokes and stuff like that, so I never really believed it and stuff.
News app and on our website. Just go to CBS.com.
Black people trying to make sense of the senseless.
And I was actually somebody that was, you know, sort of perpetuating those myths, and you know, I was being really cynical about it in the beginning, just because of the way that the media was presenting it. I was definitely somebody that was like being really sarcastic.
My cousin, who was 33 years old, her name was Alexis Denby. She lived in the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, and she died 1 week after contracting COVID-19.
My best friend did test for it, and her test results came back positive. Unfortunately, she was with me out that night when we went out, so we both think we got it from that night.
You know, you see these celebrities getting tested, and that was a bit of a shock to me, to see that, you know, they were turning normal people away from it. And when I went to the doctor initially, they said, you know, we're not testing people for COVID. You just have to go home and quarantine yourself and, you know, act like you have it, treat yourself like you have it, which was a little bit disheartening, because what does that mean to somebody who's never heard of it?
I had to have every single symptom before I can go get tested, when there's celebrities that are saying, oh, I was just around this person and they tested positive, so I'm gonna go get a test, and they get the test for it. But we're just left in the dust like we're nobody.
Losing her has been like, you know, my biggest fear, you know, realized. You know, and then after that, I was also very anxious because I was still sick, and not so, like, I was getting better, so I wasn't so much worried about myself as I was worried about my husband, who had ended up getting pneumonia on top of the COVID, and I was like afraid that I was gonna wake up and he was gonna be dead.
One of my biggest fears was that me getting an asthma attack, which I did. I started to get an anxiety attack with that as well, and I was just scared, like, this was like the end for me. This virus is real. Like I said, I'm 27 years old. It can reach us millennials, like it reaches everybody else. And people our age are dying from it. Take it from me. I went out to the bar and I had it up, which is why I'm in a predicament that I'm in now. So just listen and stay in.
You just have to pace yourself and really try to listen to your body and take care of yourself. And I really want to be able to give people hope that they can, you know, make it through this.
If I could give a message to the people in power right now, I would say that you royally screwed us on this one. They could have lessened the impact on us. You know, people didn't have to die. My cousin, 33 years old, did not have to die.
Okay, so that is the first installment in a series that we are doing, that I am lead producing about COVID-19 and its effects on the Black community. Later on this week, we'll be doing our second installment, which is going to be about medical workers and their experiences being literally right there surrounded by people who are sick with COVID-19. We'll be also profiling mental health workers and how the effects of like mental health, obviously, as it pertains to a global pandemic, and non-medical essential workers. So people who work in grocery stores, people who are FedEx workers, and the like. So when I spoke with Emily, we were trying to figure out, you know, what would be a good use of this time that we have since we're all at home. So in terms of like some of the insights that I've gained from reporting on COVID-19 and sharing some best practices as to how we can all remain informed. So one of the earlier pieces that I did about COVID-19 was about the effects of anxiety and managing coronavirus related anxiety. So I interviewed a doctor by the name of Joy Harden Bradford, who created a platform called Therapy for Black Girls. And she offered 3 therapist-approved tips for us in terms of like engaging with the news cycle. So one of them I'm going to share with you all, and then I'll expound upon it. So the first thing that she says is we want to pay attention to how much news we're consuming, because realistically, we might be tempted to just bombard ourselves with all this information because so much is uncertain at this point. And that is the only way in which we'll be able to have some clarity, or we feel like we are in control. But oftentimes that ends up making us feel worse. So one of her tips was the best use of our time in terms of engaging with the news cycle would be to once in the morning and once at night, pick the platform of your choice, but engage with the news that way, just so that we are not, just because the news cycle is 24 hours does not mean that we necessarily have to engage with it during that whole time. And the most important thing that she said was we need to make sure that we are checking in with a reputable source. So the Poynter Institute, I'm going to open up my screen again. So the Poynter Institute has 9 tips that they shared in terms of how can we evaluate the credibility of news sources. So we'll go through some of them, and this would be great for us to keep in mind as we are trying to engage with the news cycle with COVID-19. So the first tip is, who is the source of information? Is that clear to the audience, or might the source simply be the person reporting the news? So when it comes to the source, that is the individual with whom we are trusting that the information is real. So hypothetically, if I'm saying, hey, COVID-19 is disproportionately affecting and killing Black Americans, is that based on Jessica saying that? Is it based on the Associated Press? That is what we're essentially trying to figure out. And what does the source know? Does he or she have training in the area, a job title that would indicate knowledge? Some of these seem fairly straightforward, but we would be surprised, especially during a pandemic, what people are very likely to believe and perpetuate, especially when it comes to conspiracy theories and other things that might be on social media, for instance. When did the source get this knowledge? Recently, so long ago that situations might have changed. And that's why the 2 anchor points of the day, at the top of the day and at the end of the day, would be the best moments to listen for new information, because chances are early news broadcasts would want to have the latest information, as well as those at night. Where did the source get the information? Does he or she have a degree in the field? Why use this source? And how transparent is the reporting? Can the audience determine the sources of information and why they're good? The following one is, how does the source know this information? And the one that I think is the most important is, what is the past reliability and reputation of this source? So in graduate school, there was like a phrase that all of the professors would say, where you'd rather be right than to be first. And especially within this current news cycle, so many people want to make sure that they've got, that breaking news banner, that they're putting out the information that they think is the most important for audiences to know. And if people make a mistake here or there, or if they own up to their mistakes very quickly, I think that those sorts of things end up happening. It's kind of like a part of the nature of the beast, if you will. But if reliability and reputation of the source is always questionable, or if someone were to hear about it and it has like a negative reputation, that's not to say that you should discard it per se, but try to consider multiple venues. We don't have to necessarily stick to one publication for all of our news needs in this moment. And the final question is, what is the source's motive for providing the information? And hopefully it should always be to inform. If it is to persuade, people need to essentially figure out for themselves if they are trying to, buy whatever people are selling to them. Cool. All right. So we've got all of that in mind. And I think that when it comes to COVID-19, some really reputable sources, when it comes to that currently are the New York Times. They've actually removed their paywall when it comes to all of that information. And like now I'm in Miami quarantining because my apartment's too small in New York. But if I stayed in New York, I think that would have been really wonderful for me to know everything that Governor Cuomo is saying, what's happening specifically where I live, and getting the latest information. Washington Post has also been really great. As well as BBC News. I'm always interested in like the international perspective, and considering it's a global pandemic, their news is pertained to Europe, but the US has like the largest economy in the world, there are other ways where America ends up informing the global news cycle and the Associated Press. So when it comes to finding the best form of news for you when you are going to engage with it at the top or the bottom of the day, I know that some millennials, it's my generation, some of us might not necessarily like own a TV, or we won't necessarily sit down to watch 30 minutes of a nightly news program, but there are other ways to engage. For instance, there's the Skim, which is a newsletter. CNN every morning sends out 5 things that you need to know, as well as the AP. There's also podcasts. NPR has a really wonderful one called Up First, which is approximately 8 to 10 minutes, where they give you a rundown of everything that you need to know for the rest of the day. So that's something to know for the top of the day. And then you can, if there are videos on social media, there's so much information out there, and it's a matter of us parsing it out based on the 9 tips I provided above. I'm going to share my screen again because I've got a cool visual that I want to show you guys. Okay. So the Global Web Index actually broke down by generation, just because I know that the Hamilton community is made up of so many different generations, and how COVID-19 has impacted how we are engaging and how we're processing all of this. So when it comes to Gen Z, which falls between the ages of 16 to 23, the vast majority of people are consuming the videos online, and that's video content as it pertains to like news, but also streaming services. So Netflix and online videos also include things like TikToks. They made sure to mention that. With millennials, who fall between the ages of 24 and 37 years old, we're more spread out in terms of where our like news appetite is. So we've got 44% of us engaging with online videos, which makes sense considering the degree to which we're on social media. There's also 41% of us who are streaming, so Netflix, Hulu. Something that I thought was very interesting with COVID-19 is that Disney Plus and Netflix have actually, like, they're I'm trying to find the right word for it, but essentially they have like skyrocketed in terms of like the amount of users that they have because everyone's at home. So with Gen X, people between the ages of 38 and 56 years old, this is what I thought was very interesting. They've increased watching TV more than any other generation, but they're also increasingly watching television online. So I'm very curious how many of us even have like a TV in our homes, because I don't. And then the boomer generation between 57 and 64 years old, they appear to have changed their media consumption the least as a result of the pandemic. And they obviously are watching broadband TV the most. So by that, they mean they are watching the CNNs, the MSNBCs, the Fox Newses, truly engaging with that 24-hour news cycle. So that's why some of our parents might constantly be telling us, Jessica, I saw this on the news. One thing that I did think was interesting was that in the US, the World Health Organization is who most Americans trust the most in terms of providing them with accurate information about the global pandemic. But in the UK, they trusted their government the most to be able to relay that information. So all of this comes from a survey of almost 4,000 internet users between the ages of 16 and 64 across the US and the UK. Cool. All right. So another thing that's very important for us, as well as like engaging at the macro level, we live within very specific like niche areas. I know that there are people who are in Boston who are on the line. I know people in DC, et cetera, et cetera. So locally, it might be important for us to engage with our state and local news more, only because at the federal level, there are certain people who aren't necessarily trying to make wide sweeping proclamations for the nation. So your mayors, your state senators, your governors, they might actually be the ones who are impacting us the most. So just keep that in mind. Also, something I think is important as we think about COVID-19, Of course, the death count is something that's like super daunting, but there are other ways in which like our society will be, you know, irrevocably changed as a result of it. But there are so many other parts of our world that are going to be impacted. So for instance, we've got the 2020 race happening. We are definitely headed toward a recession. The census was just given out. So there's so many other ways that we need to stay informed with our news ecosystem that will be shifted due to COVID-19, but might seem more on the periphery. So just for us to keep in mind with that. Also, just for your own edification, some friends of mine, when we were discussing COVID-19, there's so many things that we can now end up essentially researching and looking up because of the disparities in the topics that COVID-19 has brought up. So for instance, how the country and the world have been affected by other pandemics and what the coverage looks like in those moments. There was a piece that I did at work where we talked about the racist history of pandemics, where, you know, historically, if we can other a particular group of people, people just end up being more closely tied to a particular illness or something negative as it pertains to health. So we know that there's been a rise in like anti-Asian sentiments because of the COVID-19. So I think that that would be something that would be interesting to research. It would also be a good time for us to look into questions we've had for a while. So for instance, why does our healthcare look a certain way when we compare how people in Canada or how people in Western Europe are dealing with the virus? Why is America's death toll not only so high, but what is it about, you know, our healthcare system that seems to be drowning in this particular moment? And ultimately, I think it's very important for us to, and even as I like tell all of you this and you're like nodding your heads understandingly, you know, we can't do it all. So it's important for us to stay engaged, but also to not overwhelm ourselves with information and just via the news cycle. So all in all, reporting on COVID-19 has like further highlighted other disparities that exist within America. So I think that moving forward, it's very important that we consider the next questions. So even when we have like a Surgeon General who says things to particularly communities of color, well, if you don't smoke, if you don't drink, then, you know, you'll be in a better off place. And even if that is true per se, I think we always have to think about why we're in a situation where we are in the first place. So why are Black and brown bodies the ones that are dying because of the coronavirus? Because of the ecosystem that has, you know, stratified and, you know, gentrified and, you know, redlined these communities over time. So I think it's important that as we engage with the news, when we think about tomorrow, we always have to think about what the starting place was and why. You know, it's just very important to ask why in the first place. So just make sure that you're following, you know, outlets, journalists, and voices who progress those stories, because it is important to, you know, learn something and then be able to like tell the people in your near communities, but it's also more important for you to understand like what's coming next, because I think that will ultimately help you stay afloat as everything remains rocky. So now more than ever, we see how interconnected we are, not only within America as a society, but globally. So it's important for us to not only remain informed and engaged, but also aware that stories evolve, and that's not to cause panic, but for us to really continue the learning process. So that's it, that's me. Any questions?
Hi, Jessica,
if
I
you'd
have
rather-
a question. Hi, I'm Ann Dubin, class of '06. Thank you so much for this. This is wonderful. The question is, so besides the root, which is wonderful, and I love reading the root, you know, I see so many publications, online and print, both, that have these big banners now when you go to their website saying, you know, donate to support our journalism in this difficult time. Besides the root, what do you think are some of the best sources of reporting, not just on COVID, but specifically on this issue of how disproportionately it's affecting communities of color? Specific journalists we could support, or specific outlets that we could support that you think are doing an exceptional job right now?
So ProPublica, they are the ones that ended up like breaking the news last week. I think they're doing a great job. The Chicago Tribune is also doing a great job. Washington Post, not unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of them seem to be larger named brands, and I feel like that's because they have not only just like the money to pay journalists to have these very specific beats. So it's like health as it pertains to race, health as it pertains to gender, and to be able to like discuss those disparities. So as you look online, I think it's more important that we ask the and what questions versus just like saying specifically the website. So if we're talking about, Black people are dying more because of COVID-19, sure. But if they don't get necessarily into the reason, journalists aren't supposed to be stenographers. Like there's a degree to which you can obviously say what someone said, but if they're not moving past it to say, because there is overpopulation or because of, health deserts and because of people living in food deserts, they have less access to healthy foods. So as a result, people eat fast food all the time. So that pertains to how they get diabetes and heart disease. They end up dying earlier, and that relates to COVID-19. So it almost sounds like you're going down a rabbit hole, but I think that if someone is pushing past this is the boilerplate sentence of, everyone's saying this now, which is great. But I think the people who genuinely are explaining why communities of color and other marginalized communities are in the spaces that they're in, those are the ones that you should probably engage with more.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a quick question, Jessica. Thanks for doing this, and thanks for the work that you're doing. Just curious about what your process is, when you're doing these pieces. I always found that they're timely and relevant, but it's something that's ever changing, it almost seems by the minute. Like, how are you making sure that your pieces are relevant, right? We're still learning a lot about this virus. And so, the piece that you just showed us is great, but it may look different in a week from now or 2 weeks from now. How are you staying up with delivering the right information and making sure that what you delivered 2 weeks ago, isn't wrong or different?
Yeah, good question, Ronald. I think that as long as pieces are like narrative driven, like people can always sympathize and understand what that is. So it's important to have stories where it's specifically saying, New York State has now had 10,000 deaths and it's closer to 11,000 due to the coronavirus. But that's where like other parts of like a media organization would like come into play. So when my story goes on social media, if we want to have a very specific tie to health and like body counts, that's what we would do there. I think for the foreseeable future, like New York, for instance, will be the epicenter of the piece. So that allows for the evergreen nature of it. But eventually, like there will be a point where hopefully, New York won't be, or if New Jersey, for instance, overtakes New York in the amount of like COVID-19 cases, then that's when editorially you would know that this isn't accurate information anymore to publicize, like widely publicize. So that's, I would say it's like narrative driven stories, working with other people so that you can be specific in other ways. For instance, in the article page, it was like more specific to what was happening in New York last week. And then also just making sure that you understand when the story has like run its course, it's run its course.
Thanks.
I have a question, Jessica. Good to see you. Happy that you're using your communication degree so well.
Hey.
So my question relates to sort of what it's like for you as a journalist. Like, how have you had to change, working remotely as a journalist? How does that working for you right
now? It's different. I think similar to like other people, there's a lot more like self-discipline that you have to have where, I could stay in like sweatpants and like a sports bra all day. And you're like, no, I will be an adult and sit at a table and like work that way. I also think that it's almost easier to overextend yourself, where like I woke up this morning at 7 and I was like, oh, I'll just like start with my story and I'll just like work on it until this essentially. But that's how end up like burnout ends up happening. So I think it's almost a taking it day by day scenario, where today it's like, okay, I have something else to do, so that's fine. But trying to stay engaged as much as possible. Like my sisters and I were talking about this earlier, where like we aren't listening to like our podcasts as much as we would, where if I was waking up every day, you know, I'm going to take a shower, I'll listen to Up First. Then when I'm going to take the train, I'll listen to the Daily. Like there are other things that were more part of my traditional schedule. So it's almost creating a new normal for yourself for as long as we will all be indoors. And I think that that's like the best way to answer the question.
Yeah, just to follow up. So when you're finding people to be in your stories and then communicating with them, is that like, are you finding them on Twitter? Or because obviously you can't just like go out and find people.
Mm-hmm.
Are you using like FaceTime? It seemed like everyone was like recorded themselves in that piece.
Mm-hmm.
And then are you using like, are there just like editors that are sort of like stitching it together from home as well? I'm just like curious about
Yeah, so it's like one woman banding it. So it's like I'll find people on Twitter just by the use of like particular hashtags, or a lot of people are degrees of separation, like someone who knows someone. In our work Slack channel, if I'll put an ask out, people will then further amplify the message. We also have like a work email address, so it's videotips@theroot.com, where people will say, hey, I saw, based on, you know, this this particular prompt, I would love to be a part of your story. And, you know, I'm pretty surprised how vulnerable and willing people are to share the story. So even with Ginny's, for instance, like I personally would not tell anyone that I was at a bar and that's how I got sick, because the internet is filled with trolls. And even though she was like living her truth, like people definitely did in the comments like not have sympathy for her, as opposed to with Celeste, where she shared that her cousin passed away. So it's almost like a challenge by choice. Like people who are likely to engage will also be on the lookout for other outlets that are trying to do something similar. Like the New York Times did something really beautiful, where people wanted to get tested for COVID-19, but unfortunately they weren't able to. And this was like in early March. So people are just willing to tell the story. So Twitter is a really great resource, just people in your extended networks as well. And I'm the one who edited like all the stories and stuff. So yeah.
It is great that we have that technology available to us. And then I'll just give a little plug. I don't think anyone on this lives in Chicago, but Block Club Chicago does some fantastic hyper local reporting. And so I like to support them, but I think that, you know, that local bit was super poignant that you pointed out. Thanks.
Jessica, this is Max. Talk about how the COVID crisis has forced shifts in data journalism and the development of being able to explain epidemiological and economic impacts to a general public. I know the New York Times about 2 weeks ago had an utterly sterling visualization of the growth in unemployment claims, where they literally broke every single rule of data visualization to illustrate the point, which if any of you have not seen, it is absolutely worth it, just because it shows mastery of the craft.
Yeah. So when I was in J school, data journalism was my least favorite class. But there are certain ways where like people have like a niche area. So whether it's data journalism, health journalism, political journalism, all data is the information about different groups of people. So being able to put it in layman's terms, I think, is the most important thing. And that's why the New York Times did, like how Max said, like such a stellar job of saying, you know, people within this specific area are more likely contracting the disease. Even within the epicenter, Queens is the epicenter. Why is that? Where are people traveling from? Where are the airports located? So I think that as long as people don't let just kind of like at face value fear numbers or what have you, and actually engage with the content, I think that's oftentimes that's where people are able to continue like asking those questions and thinking like, oh wow, this was really smart and I didn't know something and I learned something new.
Hi, my name is Allison. I apologize for my messy office. I'm one of those essential people. Can you talk a little bit about the line between, like, obviously we know that journalists aren't supposed to be partisan, but I feel like when we watch the news, there's this crisis is political because most things are political. But it seems a hesitance. I haven't seen it from the Root, but from a lot of other organizations to talk about the political either causes of this crisis or things that leadership could have done to make it better that they didn't. Or like you were talking about how some people just kind of say the facts but then don't analyze them and put them in context for the general public. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. That's a great question, Allison. I also think that specifically because I work for the Root, a lot of people are like, oh, you're Black, it makes sense, duh. But there's according to like Pew, the vast majority of like news outlets are owned disproportionately by white people, and specifically white men, specifically straight white men, like as we continue to like break it down. So proverbially everything has an agenda and leans a particular way, especially when we go all the way to the people who end up owning these media companies. That being said, I think there's a degree to which like people think that like the public good varies. So PBS and NPR might think that the public good is literally a part of like their names, like National Public Radio, public broadcasting station. So people will continue to push back, and that's why we've seen back and forths during like White House press briefings with like Yamiche Alcindor, who is with PBS NewsHour, and she's wonderful. So you'll see it with her, but sometimes when people are like more buddy, it's a bit more difficult. I think the most important thing that we can just do as like a society is just like continue to push whoever is in power, like put their feet to the fire to show their words to them. And Comedy Central, which is ironic, like the Daily Show with Trevor Noah did something very clever where every day they decided to take a statement that the president said and compare it to something that he's saying now. And that was just a way of like putting his feet to the fire in a very like non-threatening comedic way. But I think that so long as people are able to point out to like, I'm not gonna put words in people's mouth, but to the hypocrisy of people who are in the White House, or to how people are like disproportionately being affected, or why certain people are only saying certain things. Like, I'm going to have my Black person say something specifically to that community. So I think as long as people are aware of those things and not letting it slide for the sake of harmony almost, then I think that we'll all be better for it.
Hi, it's Anne again. I have a question that's related to everything you just discussed and to Allison's question. So this is about not just, where a journalist finds the line in reporting, but also, where the media puts its focus. And I know that saying the media is problematic in and of itself because it's not just one thing, obviously. But one thing I've been frustrated by, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. The mayor of San Francisco is a Black woman named London Breed.
Oh, yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Now, I know that Governor Cuomo is getting a ton of media attention because, strong leadership, good for him, rah, rah, rah. I think that the bar for what leadership looks like is so low in this country now that like anybody that can string a coherent sentence together gets props. But Mayor Breed acted very early, very decisively in putting a state of emergency in before there was even a reported case in San Francisco. And it's not to say that the Bay Area has not been affected. Obviously it has. I think there have been something like 15 deaths from COVID in the city. But by all accounts, it's gone much better than it could have gone had her leadership not been so resolute so early on. You can't prove a counterfactual. We'll never know for sure. Had she sat on her thumbs, would it have been much worse? Of course. But I mean, that's just sort of, all of this is a very long-winded way of saying, why has there not been more focus on what Mayor Breed has done or not done? I mean, it just seems to me that there's such a void in the reporting that's been done. And, you know, I knowing what we know about the way things go, I have to think that part of it is because she's a Black woman in a leadership position and that she's just being overlooked. Is there, you know, in your experience, what, you know, are there voices within your offices and the media? Like what's the chatter about her, about other Black leaders who are just kind of being completely left out of the narrative?
Great question. I think that London Breed, she's very interesting, especially considering the fact that she supported Bloomberg's when he was, so, you know, no one's perfect kind of thing.
You can't have it all, can you?
Yeah, you know. So I think that there's like a particular narrative that sells, if you will. So when we're discussing places like Detroit, for instance, like Detroit has, and New Orleans, like these are areas where the vast majority of like the constituents in a particular place are Black people and other people of color. So we can focus on death and how that looks like there. One could assume that in the Bay Area, which granted has like its own issues with like gentrification and displacement, because it's more affluent, people that like that doesn't necessarily speak to a narrative that people want to end up perpetuating almost, unfortunately. So yeah, I think that's what it is. And even with Governor Cuomo, for instance, like now it's very easy for him to be heralded as like this hero and like him and his brother going back and forth, CNN, like woohoo. But there's like a way in which like prisoners who are incarcerated are like creating hand sanitizer. And by creating, I mean like they're being forced to make hand sanitizer, but that doesn't help with like the hero narrative of President Cuomo 2024 question mark. So I think that, so I think that that's why it's important to, you know, kind of have like a healthy level of skepticism, because it's like, even if she's not being brought up, you know, those are those sorts of things that people end up, you know, putting out on social media and asking and saying like call to action, and that those like snowballs conversations end up becoming like a larger news story. So you should tweet it.
I should tweet it. I did see a piece about her in The Atlantic the other night, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's a publication I've actually heard of, writing about London Breed. But it's just, it's like with everything else that's already so depressing about this pandemic, it's like, really? Anyway, thanks.
There's one question that says, hi there, from Maritza M. How do you think what you and other journalists do will change after we can emerge from social isolation? Fun fact, Maritza is my sister and we went to J school together at USC. I think, unfortunately, news outlets and other like online publications will realize like how thinly they can like, I don't know, like great for us, like we're still putting out like really wonderful work. So I think that they're going to decrease the amount of resources that we need in the first place, because they're saying, oh, you did so well when the world was on fire, ergo we're going to, you know, cut back on the amount of people that we need on a video team. We're going to cut back on the amount of reporters that we need. Hopefully I am wrong when we come out of social isolation, but realistically, like the way in which people are able to use like iNews and other broadcast level software, and they're doing it remotely, especially with like local news here in Miami. I've seen like the weather people like doing things from home, like it's amazing. So I think that they're really going to end up cutting back because they see that we can do without, even though we shouldn't.
We have other questions? I did have one question if no one else has one. You know, I think about the way journalism changed after 9/11 and that we got this, you know, constant, everything's breaking news at the bottom of ticker. Are there are there concrete ways like that that you think how we take in our news or how the news will be presented to us will change after this?
That's a great question.
Can I add something to it too, Emily, just to make it harder? The one thing I want to add is the daily news conferences.
Mm-hmm.
Like, will they ever end? By, you know, the governor of Illinois, the mayor of Chicago, the president of the United States, like,
right.
Just to throw that in on top of it.
Do I think that the daily news conferences will end? Yes, I think everyone is tired of them collectively across the political aisle. I think that what will change, I hope things will change for the better in terms of like having an intersectional approach to news. So like at Hamilton, that was my favorite word, intersectional. But like joking aside, like it's not just COVID-19. Like when we talk about the environment, when we talk about health, when we talk about income disparity, like there are so many ways where depending on your social standing in the United States, like you are at the bottom of the totem pole. So now people are thinking, wow, X group of marginalized people are at the bottom of the totem pole because of COVID-19. So I would like to think, and I would hope that that same mentality of like who's being left behind will be incorporated into other areas of American society, because, you know, hopefully by knock knock summer, like we will be fine. And eventually this will no longer be the big thing to talk about. But when we actually do begin honing in on the 2020 race, especially when fall comes around, when we talk about the Black vote, when we talk about the women's vote, when we talk about the queer vote, things that end up having like a monolithic like stance, or it's presented in a monolithic sort of way, people will then try to bring what we had with COVID-19 and say, well, when we say people are being affected because of this, it's like, which groups of people? Like even within the case of COVID-19, like I'm hard pressed to find anyone who's discussed the concept of like ability versus disability, specifically with like mobility, and people who are bedridden, people who physically cannot leave their homes to go to a grocery store. You know, so there are so many ways where COVID-19 footage has like pushed the envelope in terms of the questions that journalists are asking. But we would be mistaken if we said that, oh, we're perfect and we have nothing else to change.
We have one more question in the chat. What impact do you think your time at Hamilton and USC had on your career today?
That's my other sister outside. They're literally outside the door. At Hamilton, like that's where my understanding of my place in American society really became concrete, because I'm from Miami, there's palm trees, not oak trees. Like there were so many ways where I felt othered on College Hill. But in that same way, it was like, okay, this is how I present myself in the world and this is how people will receive me. So taking classes like communication by, you know, articles of speech and argumentation, rhetoric, like that was obviously something that was very important. But the women's studies aspect and those classes with Professor Laksamana and Professor Barry, like them saying like, okay, them pushing me and making me constantly like keep thinking. And it's like, why is that? Well, why is that? Well, why is that? And obviously it annoyed me as I wrote my thesis, but now in the newsroom, I'm able to continue to ask those questions. And I think the further you push and the more questions you ask, the better the story becomes. And in terms of USC, I think USC has like one of the best just like journalism schools like in the nation. And even though there's like, you know, kids paying to get in, it's still a really good school. And me being able to write from Hamilton and then turning that into news writing from USC, like that is something that has changed my life for the better. So great question, Maika.
Do we have other questions? Okay. Jessica, I thought this was great and so helpful. And I just can't thank you enough for doing this, especially I feel like I really just dumped it on you. So I was like,
okay.
This is what I'd love to hear about. So I can't thank you enough. And I think I can speak for the whole group when I say we are better for it. So thank you.
Yay. Thanks for coming. You literally could be doing anything else, like watching Netflix. So thank you.
All right. Thank you all. I really appreciate you joining.
I just want to add to that, Jessica, for anyone who arrived late, Jessica said she'd share the link so that you could watch the videos.
Yeah, I'll do it right now.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Jessica.